I never thought I'd see Eleanor Blackwood, who'd spent 40 years looking down her nose at me, sprawled face first in my anniversary cake, the sound her body made hitting that antique oak table, wood cracking, china shattering, champagne glasses toppling like dominoes, silenced 50 guests in an instant. But it wasn't her fall that froze everyone mid-breath. It was what little Theo, my 11-year-old grandson, said next, standing there clutching that yellowed deed in his trembling hands. Grandma Martha never sold this farm. The paper says she still owns everything. The moment those words left Theo's mouth, I watched my son Richard's face transform from performative concern for his mother to something feral and unrecognizable. His eyes darted to his brother James, then to their father Earl, who'd gone so pale I thought he might collapse too. 43 years I'd believed the lie. 43 years of holidays where I wasn't welcome on their property. 43 years of Eleanor's smug reminders that I was just the help's daughter, who got lucky. Now everyone at our anniversary party knew the truth. The sprawling 180-acre Blackwood heritage farm that had made the family millions had legally belonged to me all along. I still remember the weight of that silence, the kind that has texture and temperature, cold and thick like winter fog rolling across those fields I'd spent my childhood working, but never feeling welcome in. My husband, Thomas the only Blackwood who'd ever treated me with genuine kindness, reached for my hand under the table, his palm damp with sweat. What happened in the next 4 minutes would shatter a dynasty built on stolen land and decades of carefully constructed lies. I had no idea then that the moisture I felt on my wrist wasn't just Thomas's nervous perspiration, but the first drops of blood from what would become his final heart attack. That day started like any other significant date in the Blackwood family calendar, with Eleanor micromanaging every detail while making sure I understood my place. The spring sunlight streamed through the windows of the farmhouse that morning, dancing across the hardwood floors Thomas's great-grandfather had laid with his own hands, the same floors I'd scrubbed as a teenager when my mother was hired as the Blackwoods' housekeeper. I was in the kitchen arranging wildflowers for the table's centerpieces, blue cornflowers and Queen Anne's lace I'd gathered from the meadow behind the barn when Eleanor swept in wearing her signature pearls and a salmon-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car. "Martha," she said, not bothering to hide her disapproval as she surveyed my work, "these look rustic." The way she said the word made it sound like a disease. "I've ordered proper arrangements from Bellamy's in town. They'll be here by noon. You can put these," she waved dismissively at my flowers, "somewhere out of the way. Perhaps the guest bathroom." Then she smiled, that tight smile that never reached her eyes. "After all, this is a celebration of Thomas marrying into the Blackwood legacy. We want everything to reflect our family's standards." The same refrain I'd heard at every birthday, Christmas, and anniversary for over 4 decades. I'll tell you exactly how many times she'd reminded me I wasn't a real Blackwood later, because I started keeping count after the first 10 years. I nodded and said, "Of course, Eleanor." Just like I always did. Thomas and I had been married for 45 years, raised 3 children, and weathered everything from market crashes to drought. And still, in her eyes, I remained the housekeeper's daughter who'd somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. What Eleanor never understood or refused to acknowledge was that Thomas and I had fallen in love when we were just 17, long before either of us cared about land or legacy. We would meet secretly by the old sycamore tree that marked the eastern border of the farm, where the sunset painted everything gold and made even the mundane feel magical. Thomas would bring books of poetry and read to me while I made daisy chains and dreamed of a future where I wasn't defined by my mother's position. Our love story was simple but true, unlike the complicated web of deceit that the rest of the Blackwoods had spun around the farm's ownership after my grandmother Martha passed away. You see, my grandmother had worked for the Blackwoods too, but unlike my mother, she'd formed a genuine friendship with Thomas's grandmother, Evelyn Blackwood. So much so that when Evelyn was diagnosed with cancer in 1979, she made a decision that would remain hidden for nearly half a century. She sold Martha half the farm for a symbolic sum of $1, with the provision that the transaction remained their secret until Martha felt the time was right to reveal it. My grandmother never did. Even on her deathbed, she kept her promise to her friend, telling me only that she'd left me something precious that I would discover when I needed it most. I had no idea what she meant then, No inkling that while I'd been treated like an outsider by the Blackwoods all these years, my grandmother had actually owned half of their precious family legacy. After she died, I'd received nothing but a small cedar box filled with what seemed like meaningless mementos: a pressed flower, a tarnished silver thimble, some old photographs, and a key to a safety deposit box I never found. I'd kept the box on my dresser all these years, occasionally opening it to feel connected to the woman who'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was just 8 years old. The box smelled of cedar and lavender sachets, a scent that always transported me back to my grandmother's tiny cottage on the edge of what we all believed was Blackwood land. By noon, the farmhouse was buzzing with caterers, staff setting up tables under the grand oak trees, and family members arriving from across the country. Our anniversary party was doubling as the annual Blackwood family reunion, Inor's idea, not mine. She'd insisted that since they were already flying in relatives from as far as Seattle and Boston, it made fiscal sense to combine the events. The subtext, of course, was clear. The reunion was the main event. Our anniversary was secondary. I'd agreed because it made Thomas happy to see his extended family, and after 45 years, I'd learned to pick my battles with Eleanor. I'll share the exact budget she allocated for Thomas and Martha's portion of the celebration. The Terra number that still makes my blood boil when I recall how she itemized it in her meticulous handwriting. Our 3 children had arrived early to help with preparations. Rebecca, our eldest, a cardiothoracic surgeon from Chicago with her husband Richard and their son Theo. Michael, our middle child, a literature professor at UCLA who'd flown in with his partner. James, and Lily, our youngest, a wildlife photographer who was between assignments in Alaska. They were my pride and joy, each successful in their own way despite Eleanor's constant implications that their achievements must have come from the Blackwood genes. Blood will tell, she'd say whenever one of them received an award or recognition, as though my contribution to their DNA was something to be overcome rather than celebrated. Theo had always been a curious child, more interested in history and old things than video games and sports. At 11, he was already talking about becoming an archaeologist, much to his father Richard's dismay. Richard, a corporate attorney with political ambitions, had very specific ideas about acceptable career paths for a family with connections. That morning, while the adults were busy with party preparations, Theo had asked if he could explore the old barn where Thomas stored generations of Blackwood artifacts and memorabilia. I'd given him permission, making him promise to be careful around the antique farm equipment. There are stories in old things, I told him, tucking a stray lock of his sandy hair behind his ear. Sometimes they wait years to be told. I had no idea how prophetic those casual words would prove to be. The party began at 3 o'clock, with guests gathering on the sprawling lawn behind the farmhouse. Tables draped in white linen formed a semicircle around a wooden dance floor Thomas and Michael had constructed. The previous weekend, Eleanor had positioned herself near the entrance, playing the role of family matriarch as she greeted guests with air kisses and practiced charm. Thomas's father, Earl Blackwood, now 89 and reliant on a walker, sat in a place of honor near the head table. Though physically diminished, his eyes retained the sharp calculation that had helped him transform what was once a modest family farm into an agricultural empire spanning 3 counties. He'd never warmed to me either, viewing his son's choice of bride as a momentary lapse in judgment that, unfortunately for him, had resulted in a lasting marriage. I was adjusting a place setting when I felt a tug on my sleeve. Theo stood beside me, his face flushed with excitement or exertion, I couldn't tell which. "Grandma," he whispered, "I found something amazing in the old trunk behind Grandpa's tractor. Can I show you?" There was urgency in his voice that made me take notice. I glanced around. The guests were mingling, drinks in hand, and Thomas was deep in conversation with his brother about crop rotation, or cattle prices, or whatever agricultural topic typically dominated these gatherings. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, "but we'll need to be quick. The toasts will start soon. And you know how great Grandma Eleanor gets if the schedule is disrupted." Theo led me away from the party and toward the old barn, his small hand gripping mine tightly. "I was looking through the photo albums," he explained breathlessly as we walked, "and I found this hidden in the binding of the oldest one." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, yellowed with age and creased from decades of being concealed. It looks important, but I wanted to show you first before anyone else. There was wisdom beyond his years in that decision, sensitivity to family dynamics he'd obviously inherited from Thomas's side, not Richard's. Later, I'd learn exactly why he'd chosen me instead of his father or great-grandmother. But in that moment, I was simply touched by his trust. We stopped just inside the barn door, where the late afternoon sun sliced through the slats in the weathered wood, creating bars of golden light across the dirt floor. I unfolded the paper carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I realized what I was holding. It was a deed, dated October 14, 1979, transferring ownership of half of Blackwood Heritage Farm from Evelyn Blackwood to my grandmother, Martha Collins. Attached was a handwritten letter from Evelyn to my grandmother. My dearest Martha, you have been more family to me than those who share my blood. This land has seen your tears and sweat as much as any Blackwood's. Let this deed remain our secret until you choose otherwise. But know that half of this earth is rightfully yours, as is my eternal gratitude. With love, Evelyn. My vision blurred with tears as the pieces fell into place. My grandmother had owned half this farm for all these years but had kept Evelyn's gift secret, even from me. Why? The answer came in the form of a second note, this one, in my grandmother's handwriting, dated just weeks before her death. My beloved granddaughter. When you find this, Dion, I trust you will, when the time is right, know that I kept this secret not from shame, but from respect for a promise made to my dearest friend. Evelyn wanted you and Thomas to find happiness without the burden of family conflict. But if the day comes when you need this truth, use it wisely, not for revenge, but for justice. All my love, Grandma Martha. I'll share the exact wording of both notes when we get to the courthouse scene, where every word became critically important. Theo watched my face intently as I read, his eyes wide with the intuitive understanding that he'd uncovered something momentous. Is it important, Grandma? He asked. The simplicity of his question broke through my shock. Yes, Theo, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. It's very important. It means, but before I could explain, Eleanor's voice cut through the air, sharp as a scythe. Martha, Theodore, the toasts are about to begin, and you're making us wait. Really, Martha, after all these years, you still haven't learned proper etiquette. She stood framed in the barn doorway, her slight figure casting a disproportionately large shadow across the floor between us. I quickly refolded the deed and slipped it into my dress pocket, but something in my expression must have alerted Eleanor that something was amiss. What are you hiding? She demanded, stepping closer. I could smell her expensive perfume. Chanel, No. 5, the same scent she'd worn for 50 years, as if changing fragrances might somehow diminish her status. Nothing that can't wait until after the party, I replied, placing a protective hand on Theo's shoulder. We were just reminiscing. Theo found some old photos. Eleanor's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but the sound of Thomas calling her name from the direction of the gathering saved me from further interrogation. This isn't over, she hissed as she turned to leave. I know when people are keeping secrets in my home. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. If only she knew whose home it really was. We returned to the party, my mind reeling with implications while I maintained the pleasant facade I'd perfected over decades of Blackwood family functions. Thomas noticed my distraction during the toasts, raising an eyebrow questioningly across the rim of his champagne glass as his cousin droned on about family heritage and the importance of keeping land in Blackwood hands for generations to come. I gave him a reassuring smile, but beneath the table, my fingers traced the outline of the folded deed in my pocket. How would I tell my husband of 45 years that half of his family's celebrated legacy rightfully belonged to me? And more importantly, how would his family, particularly Eleanor and Earl, react to this revelation? The answer came sooner than I'd planned, in a way I could never have predicted. After the toasts, as guests mingled and the catering staff began serving the anniversary kaika, three-tiered creation decorated with fondant replicas of blue cornflowers and Queen Anne's, laced my small victory over Eleanor's proper arrangements, Theo appeared at my side again. Grandma, he whispered urgently, I heard Great-Grandpa Earl and Uncle James talking behind the rose trellis. They said something about Martha never finding out and keeping the paperwork buried. I think they know about the deed. The alarm in his voice matched the sudden chill that ran through me. If Earl and James were discussing this, it meant they knew about Evelyn's transfer of land to my grandmother. They'd known all along. Before I could process this new information, Eleanor clinked her crystal water glass with a silver spoon, calling for attention. She stood beside the anniversary cake, her posture regal as she addressed the gathering. "Before we cut the cake," she announced, "Earl has a special presentation to make." Thomas's father rose shakily from his seat, assisted by James, and made his way to Eleanor's side. In his hands was a leather portfolio embossed with the Blackwood family crest, a black oak tree with roots that extended beyond the edges of the design. "Today," Earl began, his voice wavering with age but still commanding, "as we celebrate Thomas and Martha's 4th anniversary, I want to make an announcement about the future of Blackwood Heritage Farm." He paused for effect, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before settling on Thomas. "As you all know, this land has been in Blackwood hands since 1891, when my grandfather cleared these fields and built this house with nothing but determination and faith." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd. "Today, I am officially announcing that upon my passing, Blackwood Heritage Farm will be placed in trust for the benefit of all future Blackwood generations, under the stewardship of my grandsons, James and Richard, not Thomas, not the son who'd actually worked the land alongside his father for over 50 years, but his nephews, Eleanor's nephews, who had never shown any interest in farming beyond its investment potential." I felt Thomas stiffen beside me, the hurt evident in the sudden tension of his shoulders. This was a public humiliation disguised as a family announcement. Watched Richard and James exchange satisfied glances across the gathering. They'd known this was coming. Eleanor's triumphant smile confirmed that she had orchestrated the entire scene. I'd experienced many slights over the years, but seeing Thomas dismissed from his birthright in front of 50 guests on our anniversary was beyond cruel. And now I understood why. They had been planning this announcement for months, perhaps years, knowing that if the truth about my grandmother's partial ownership ever came to light, it would threaten their carefully constructed plans for the farm's future. What happened next occurred in a sequence so rapid, yet so crystal clear in my memory, that I can recall each moment, as if it were unfolding in slow motion. Theo, who had been standing behind me listening to his great-grandfather's speech, suddenly bolted forward toward the cake table where Earl and Eleanor stood. "That's not fair," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "And it's not true." All heads turned toward this unexpected interruption. Richard moved to intercept his son, hissing, "Theodore, sit down right now." But Theo dodged his father's grasp and continued toward Earl, pulling from his pocket the folded deed I'd returned to him for safekeeping. "Great-grandpa, you can't decide that by yourself," Theo continued, his small voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "Because this farm doesn't just belong to Blackwoods, it belongs to Grandma Martha too." Eleanor's face contorted with indignation. "Young man, that is quite enough. You clearly don't understand adult matters. Richard, control your child." But Richard stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the yellowed paper in his son's hand. Earl's expression had transformed from patriarchal authority to something I'd never seen before on his face. Fear. Pure, undisguised fear. "What nonsense is this boy talking about?" he demanded, but the tremor in his voice betrayed that he already knew. Eleanor, determined to regain control of the situation, stepped forward and attempted to snatch the deed from Theo's hand. "This is ridiculous. Whatever game you're playing, Martha using a child to disrupt the family announcement, it's disgraceful." In her agitation, she knocked against the table where the anniversary cake stood. The table, an antique oak piece that had been in the Blackwood family for generations, had one slightly shorter leg, a flaw normally compensated for by a discreet wooden shim. But in the commotion, the shim had been displaced. As Eleanor lunged for the deed, her weight shifted the table. The leg gave way with a splintering crack. Eleanor, the cake, and several champagne glasses went crashing down in a catastrophic symphony of destruction. There she lay, Eleanor Blackwood, face down in buttercream and fondant, her salmon dress now a canvas of blue and white frosting. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Theo, still clutching the deed, spoke into that silence with the devastating clarity that only children can muster. "Grandma Martha never sold this farm. The paper says she still owns everything." He held up the deed, now unfolded for all to see. It's got a real stamp and signature and everything. My teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, taught us about property documents last month for history class. This is legal. Grandma Martha owns half the farm, just like great-grandma Evelyn wanted. Every eye in the gathering moved from Eleanor's frosting-covered form to my face. I stood, my legs somehow supporting me despite feeling like they might give way. Thomas, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I just found out today. I never knew. My husband of 45 years looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then his gaze shifted to his father. Dad. The single word contained a lifetime of questions. Earl Blackwood, patriarch of the family and architect of its fortune, seemed to age a decade in that moment. He gripped the edge of the collapsed table for support, no longer the imposing figure who had moments ago been dictating the future of a dynasty. Richard was the first to recover his composure. He strode forward, attorney mode activated, and held out his hand to Theo. Son, give me that paper. This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding that adults need to sort out privately. But Theo, showing a resolve that made my heart swell with pride, stepped back and shook his head. No, Dad. I found it, and I gave it to Grandma Martha. Because it belongs to her. You always tell me that property rights are the foundation of our society. That's what you said in your campaign speech last month. Several guests murmured in agreement, and I saw Richard's carefully constructed political persona begin to crack around the edges. James, ever the pragmatist, attempted to diffuse the situation with forced joviality. Well, this is certainly an unexpected turn to our celebration. Why don't we help Eleanor up, serve what's left of the cake, and discuss this family matter tomorrow when we've all had time to process? His suggestion might have gained traction if Eleanor hadn't chosen that moment to rise from the ruins of the cake, her face a mask of fury beneath layers of frosting. There is nothing to discuss, she snarled. This is preposterous. Any supposed deed is obviously a forgery. Martha has always been jealous of this family. She's poisoned Thomas against us for years, and now she's using her grandson to try to steal what rightfully belongs to the Blackwoods. That was the moment I felt something shift inside me. A lifetime of accommodating, appeasing, and swallowing insults crystallized into a hard, immovable resolve. I walked over to Theo and placed my hand on his shoulder. May I asked gently. He nodded and handed me the deed. I held it up so that everyone could see the official seal, the signatures, the date. This is not a forgery, I said, my voice carrying across the stunned gathering. This is a legal transfer of property from Evelyn Blackwood to my grandmother, Martha Collins, dated October 14, 1979. Half of Blackwood Heritage Farm has belonged to my family for 43 years. I turned to face Earl directly. And you knew, didn't you? You all knew. The blood drained from Earl's face so rapidly that for a moment I feared he might collapse. Eleanor rushed to his side, frosting still smeared across her expensive dress. Don't you dare accuse my husband, she began, but Earl raised a trembling hand to silence her. When? He asked me, his voice barely audible. When did you find out? The question confirmed everything. They had known all along. They had treated me like an outsider on land that was partially mine by right. They had planned to disinherit Thomas from property that should have been jointly ours to pass down. Today, I answered truthfully. Theo found it hidden in an old photo album in the barn. My grandmother left me a note saying I would find it when the time was right. I looked around at the gathering of Blackwood relatives, some confused, others uncomfortable, a few nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were finally fitting together. I never knew. All these years I believed what you told me, that I was lucky to marry into this family, that I should be grateful for every Blackwood kindness. My voice broke slightly, decades of suppressed hurt rising to the surface. But it seems I was the one showing kindness by never questioning why my grandmother, who raised me after my parents died, left me nothing but a box of keepsakes. Thomas moved to stand beside me, his presence solid and reassuring against the storm of revelation. He took the deed from my hands and studied it carefully, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. After a long moment, he looked up, first at his father, then at his mother, and finally at James and Richard. This appears entirely legitimate, he said quietly. Dad, You were executor of Grandma Evelyn's estate. Did you know about this? The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Earl Blackwood, master of the carefully constructed half-truth, found himself cornered by simple honesty. She was dying, Earl finally said, his voice thin with age and defeat. Cancer had spread everywhere. The doctors gave her weeks. She wasn't thinking clearly. He looked imploringly at Thomas. You have to understand, son. This land, it's our heritage. 5 generations of Blackwoods. Couldn't let half of it go to Pate, to the housekeeper. The naked prejudice in his words hung in the air like poison. So when I found the deed among her papers after she died, I kept it safe. I thought Martha Collins would come forward, make a claim, but she never did. And then when she passed, I assumed the secret had died with her. Eleanor, still trying to salvage the situation, interjected, it was for the best. This farm needs unified management to thrive. Splitting ownership would have been disastrous. Her eyes darted nervously to the guests who were witnessing this family implosion in Rialton. Besides, Martha has enjoyed all the benefits of Blackwood prosperity. She's lived in this house, been treated as family. Thomas cut her off with a gesture so uncharacteristically sharp that it startled even me. Been treated as family, he repeated incredulously. Mom, you've never treated Martha as family. Not once in 45 years. The truth of his words silenced Eleanor. Momentarily, into that silence, Richard stepped forward, his attorney's mind clearly calculating angles and strategies. Let's all calm down, he said smoothly. This is a complex legal situation that requires careful examination. The statute of limitations on property claims may well have expired. There are questions of intent, of proper filing. He reached for the deed, but Thomas pulled it away. No, Richard, my husband said firmly. This isn't going to be buried in legal maneuvers and delays. My grandmother wanted Martha's grandmother to have half this farm. That was her choice to make. I felt Thomas's hand close around mine, warm and steady as it had been for 45 years of marriage. And now we have a choice to make, he continued, addressing the entire gathering but looking directly at his parents. We can acknowledge the truth and find a way forward together. Or, we can tear this family apart fighting over land that none of us created, land that was here long before Blackwoods and will be here long after we're gone. It was the wisdom I'd always loved in him, the ability to see beyond immediate self-interest to the larger picture. But what happened next would test that wisdom to its breaking point. Earl, perhaps sensing that public opinion among the gathered relatives was shifting away from him, attempted to regain control of the narrative. He straightened as much as his aged spine would allow and addressed me directly. Martha, be reasonable. What would you even do with half a working farm? You have no agricultural experience, no knowledge of the business side. His tone was conciliatory on the surface, but I could hear the condescension underneath. I'm prepared to offer you a generous settlement, $5 million to relinquish any claim based on this unexpected document. That's more than fair market value. Before I could respond, Thomas swayed suddenly beside me, his hand going to his chest. His face had turned an alarming shade of gray. Thomas, I said, alarm rising in my voice. Are you all right? He tried to answer, but only a pained gasp escaped his lips. Then he collapsed, the deed floating from his grasp like an autumn leaf. I caught him before he hit the ground, easing him down as voices erupted around us. Call 911. Someone shouted. Rebecca, our daughter, the cardiothorax surgeon, was already rushing to her father's side, her medical training taking over as she loosened his collar and checked his pulse. Dad, can you hear me? She called, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as fear for her father seeped through. It's his heart, she told me, her fingers pressed to his wrist. Irregular pulse. He needs a hospital now. The next minutes were chaos, guests clearing space, Rebecca performing CPR, the distant wail of approaching sirens cutting through the late afternoon air. Through it all, I held Thomas's hand, whispering the same words over and over. Stay with me. Please stay with me. I was barely aware of Eleanor standing frozen nearby, or of Earl being helped to a chair, his own face now ashen with shock. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. I know because I counted every second and worked with efficient urgency. Thomas was still breathing, but his heartbeat was dangerously irregular. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Rebecca turned to me. "I'm coming with you," she said, then glanced back at the disrupted party. "Michael and Lily will handle things here." I nodded mutely. My entire world narrowed to the thin thread of life still connecting my husband to this earth. As the ambulance doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the gathering, stunned guests beginning to disperse. Michael and Lily speaking intently to Eleanor and Earl, and Theo standing exactly where we'd left him, the deed once again clutched in his small hands, his face a portrait of confusion and fear. During the ride to Mercy Regional Hospital, I held Thomas's cold hand while Rebecca assisted the paramedics. The siren wailed above us, a keening soundtrack to the most terrifying 27 minutes of my life. "BP dropping," one paramedic announced as they attached another monitor to my husband's chest. "Beginning vasopressor drip." Medical terminology washed over me in waves I couldn't process. All I could see was Thomas's face, unnaturally still beneath the oxygen mask. The same face I'd woken up beside for over 16,000 mornings. I remembered our first date at County Fair, where he'd won me a stuffed bear by knocking down milk bottles, and the nervous tremor in his hands when he'd proposed 6 months later. I thought of the 3 children we'd raised, the storms we'd weathered, the life we'd built together from love and compromise and shared dreams. "Martha." Rebecca's voice broke through my memories. Her eyes, so like her father's, were steady, despite the fear I knew she must be feeling. "Dad's having a major cardiac event, likely a heart attack. When we get to the hospital, they'll take him straight to the cardiac catheterization lab. I've already called ahead to Dr. Patelis, the best cardiologist in the state. Dad's going to get the very best care possible." She squeezed my shoulder, her touch anchoring me to reality. "But I need you to prepare yourself. This is serious." The ambulance lurched as it took a corner, and one of the monitors beeped more insistently. Rebecca immediately turned back to assist the paramedics, her training overriding her role as daughter in this critical moment. We arrived at the emergency entrance with the screech of tires. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Thomas whisked away on a gurney. Forms thrust at me to sign, questions about medical history and allergies that I answered on autopilot. Rebecca disappeared with her father into the restricted area of the cardiac unit, while I was directed to a private waiting room reserved for families of critical patients. The room was painted a soft blue meant to be calming, with upholstered chairs and landscape paintings that barely registered in my peripheral vision. I sat alone, Thomas's wallet and phone in a clear plastic hospital bag on my lap, the weight of them a poor substitute for his presence. Slowly, family members began to arrive. Michael and James came first, followed by Lily, who had stopped to pick up Earl and Eleanor. Theo slipped in quietly and came directly to sit beside me, his small hand finding mine without a word. Despite everything that had happened, the revelation that had turned our anniversary celebration into a battlefield of long-buried secrets, we were still a family, united in fear for Thomas. Even Eleanor, her face now scrubbed clean of cake frosting and makeup, sat rigidly across from me, her usual imperious demeanor replaced by genuine worry for her son. 3 hours and 22 minutes after Thomas had collapsed, Rebecca emerged through the double doors, still wearing scrubs with a surgical cap in her hand. The expression on her face told me everything before she spoke a single word. I stood, my legs somehow supporting me, though I felt hollowed out, an autumn husk ready to crumble at the slightest touch. "Mom," she said, her professional composure finally breaking as tears filled her eyes. "We did everything we could. Dr. Patel tried to place stents, but Dad's coronary arteries were too severely blocked. He suffered a massive myocardial infarction. His heart couldn't recover. I'm so sorry, Mom. Dad is gone." The words hit me like physical blows. Thomas, gone. My husband, my partner, my best friend for nearly half a century, suddenly absent from the world. I heard gasps and sobs around me, felt Theo's hand tighten on mine, saw Eleanor collapse into James's arms, but it all seemed distant, happening in another room to other people. Rebecca reached for me, and I moved into her embrace automatically, but I felt nothing, as if my body had decided that this pain was too great to process all at once and had simply shut down instead. "Can I see him?" I heard myself ask. my voice strange and hollow in my ears. Rebecca nodded. Of course. They're preparing him now. I'll take you back in a few minutes. I sat back down, Theo still clinging to my hand. He looked up at me with eyes swimming in tears. I'm sorry, Grandma, he whispered. Is it my fault, because I found the paper? The innocent question pierced through my emotional numbness. I pulled him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against mine. No, sweetheart, not at all. Grandpa had a bad heart for a long time. This would have happened eventually, paper or no paper. It wasn't entirely true. The stress of the confrontation had undoubtedly contributed to Thomas's heart attack, but I couldn't bear for Theo to carry that burden, to associate his natural curiosity and sense of justice with his grandfather's death. I looked across the waiting room at Eleanor, who sat with her head bowed, looking suddenly much older than her 87 years. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something passed between us, not forgiveness or understanding, exactly, but a shared recognition of loss that transcended our decades of mutual resentment. Thomas had been the bridge between us, and now that bridge was gone. Later that night, after I'd said my final goodbye to Thomas in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and finality, after I'd touched his face one last time and whispered promises that only he would hear, I returned home to the farmhouse that had never fully felt like mine despite the decades I'd lived there. The remnants of the party had been cleared away, the collapsed table removed, the anniversary cake and its destruction erased as if they'd never existed. But the reality remained, inescapable and twofold. Thomas was gone, and half of Blackwood Heritage Farm legally belonged to me. I sat alone in our bedroom, the cedar box that had been my grandmother's open on my lap. Inside was the key to the safety deposit box I'd never found until now, when it was suddenly obvious where to look. My grandmother's note had mentioned, "When you need this truth," and now I understood. She hadn't wanted me to find the deed until it was necessary. She'd protected me from potential conflict with the Blackwoods, knowing how important my relationship with Thomas was to me. But she'd also ensured that if I ever needed proof of ownership, it would be waiting. The truth had emerged exactly when it needed to, at a cost I could never have imagined. The days that followed moved with the strange, disjointed rhythm that accompanies profound grief. Funeral arrangements, visitors bringing casseroles and condolences, decisions about obituaries and flowers and music. Through it all, the deed remained in my possession, carefully placed in a fireproof safe in Thomas's office. I didn't mention it, and neither did the Blackwoods. We existed in an uneasy truce born of shared mourning, the question of the farm's ownership temporarily set aside in deference to the more immediate reality of Thomas's absence. But I knew this peace couldn't last. There was too much at stake, too many decades of careful planning disrupted by my grandmother's long-hidden claim. It was Earl who broke the silence, 3 days after we buried Thomas, beneath the old sycamore tree where we'd first fallen in love as teenagers. He came to the farmhouse alone, without Eleanor, rare occurrence that signaled the seriousness of his purpose. I received him in Thomas's office, the space still filled with my husband's presence, his reading glasses on the desk, farming journals stacked neatly on the credenza, the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he occasionally indulged in despite doctor's orders. Earl looked diminished somehow, as if Thomas's death had hollowed him out from the inside, leaving just the brittle shell of the formidable man he'd once been. "Martha," he began, lowering himself carefully into the leather chair across from me. "I've come to talk about the farm, direct and to the point, the Blackwood way." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. He sighed heavily, the sound carrying the weight of his 89 years. "What happened at the party, the revelation about Evelyn's deed to your grandmother, it shouldn't have come out that way. You deserved to know the truth long ago." It was as close to an apology as Earl Blackwood had ever come in all the years I'd known him. But what's done is done. Now we need to decide how to move forward. I studied the man across from me, my Dedla, the architect of the Blackwood agricultural empire, and the keeper of secrets that had shaped decades of family history. "Yes," I agreed quietly. "We do need to decide. But first, I need to understand why. Why keep this from me, all these years? Why pretend my grandmother left me nothing when you knew half this farm was rightfully mine?" The questions I'd been holding back since the moment Theo had placed that yellowed deed in my hands. Earl's gaze dropped to his gnarled hands, fingers twisted by arthritis and years of hard physical labor before wealth had allowed him to hire others to work the land. Fear, he admitted after a long pause, and pride, mostly pride. This farm, it's been the center of everything for me. My identity, my legacy. The idea of sharing control with someone outside the bloodline. He stopped abruptly. Perhaps realizing how his words would sound to me. That was wrong thinking. I see that now. But back then, when I found the deed among Mother's papers, I convinced myself I was protecting the farm, protecting the family business. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly, and then time passed, and the lie became harder to undo. Every year that went by made it more impossible to come clean. I understood, even as the justification angered me. The Blackwood pride was legendary in the county. A point of both admiration and resentment among neighbors who'd watched the family's holdings grow while their own farms struggled. And Eleanor, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Earl's expression confirmed it. She was more adamant than I was about keeping the secret. She never quite accepted you as Thomas's wife, let alone as co-owner of the Blackwood legacy. The understatement would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Eleanor's 4 decades of subtle and not so subtle undermining flashed through my mind, the barbed comments, the exclusion from family decisions, the constant reminders of my supposedly inferior origins. What exactly are you proposing now, Earl? I asked, steering the conversation back to its purpose. He straightened slightly, businessman mode, engaging despite his grief and age. I want to buy your half of the farm, Martha. A fair price, more than fair. You'd be financially secure for the rest of your life. Your children and grandchildren, too. He named a figure that made my eyebrows rise involuntarily. $15 million. 3 times what he'd offered at the party. Think about it. What would you even do with half a farm? You're not a farmer. The practical course is to sell your portion and let the Blackwood Trust continue to manage the land as it has for generations. The offer was generous, far beyond market value for even the most productive agricultural land in the county. It was also exactly what I'd expected. The Blackwoods had always believed money could solve any problem, smooth over any conflict, and perhaps, before Thomas's death, I might have considered it. Might have weighed the benefits of financial security against the headaches of co-ownership with a family that had never truly accepted me. But something had shifted within me during those silent hours beside my husband's hospital bed, something fundamental and immovable. I'm not selling, Earl, I said, my voice steady and certain. This land was meant to be partially mine, by your mother's explicit wish. She wanted my grandmother to have it, and through her, me. If that wish had been honored from the beginning, who knows how different the last 43 years might have been. I saw the shock register on his face, followed by the beginning of anger. He hadn't expected refusal. The Blackwoods rarely encountered resistance to their will, especially when backed by substantial financial incentives. Be reasonable, Martha, he urged, leaning forward intently. You're grieving. We all are. This isn't the time for emotional decisions. The farm requires experienced management, substantial capital for equipment and infrastructure, knowledge of agricultural markets. I cut him off with a raised hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically assertive that it startled both of us. I worked this land to Earl for 45 years alongside Thomas. I may not have your business connections or your capital, but I know this earth, and I have 3 children who've grown up learning its rhythms and requirements. URL's face hardened, the momentary vulnerability replaced by the calculating expression I recognized from countless business negotiations I'd witnessed over the years. If you force this issue, it won't go smoothly, he warned. Richard is already researching legal challenges to the deed's validity. The statute of limitations, improper filing, questions about Evelyn's competence when she signed. There are numerous avenues to pursue. It could take years in court, drain resources, create a public spectacle that would damage the Blackwood name and the farm's reputation. I had expected this tooth-veiled threat, the reminder of the Blackwoods' vastly superior resources, for a protracted legal battle, but I was prepared. I've already spoken with an attorney, I informed him calmly, a property rights specialist from Boston. According to her initial assessment, the deed is entirely legitimate, properly executed, notarized, and while it wasn't officially recorded at the time, that doesn't invalidate the transfer of ownership. As for Evelyn's competence, her letter accompanying the deed is articulate, specific, and clearly intentional. I didn't mention that the attorney had been Rebecca's law school roommate, who had driven down immediately upon hearing about our situation, bringing with her decades of experience in exactly this type of property dispute. Earl's expression suggested he hadn't expected me to have secured legal counsel so quickly. Another miscalculation based on his perception of me as passive, accommodating Martha, the housekeeper's daughter, who should be grateful for Blackwood generosity. "What exactly do you want?" he asked finally, the question stripped of pretense. "If not money, then what?" "Revenge for years of perceived slights. Your moment of triumph over Eleanor. Because I can tell you now, you won't get either. My wife will never acknowledge your claim, never accept you as an equal partner in this land." The accusation stung, but I refused to let it distract me. "This isn't about revenge, Earl, or triumph. It's about justice for my grandmother, for me, and for Thomas." His name seemed to hover in the air between us. He never knew the truth, but I believe he would have wanted his father to do the right thing. Finally, I leaned forward, holding Earl's gaze steadily. "I want acknowledgement, public recognition that half of Blackwood Heritage Farm rightfully belongs to the Collins family, and has for over 40 years. I want my name man through me, my grandmother's name on all legal documents related to the property, and I want a role in decisions about its future." Earl was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with effort that betrayed his age more than any wrinkle or gray hair, he pushed himself up from the chair. "I'll discuss your terms with the family," he said stiffly. "But don't expect consensus. There's too much at stake." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with an expression that mingled resignation and something almost like respect. "Thomas chose well," he said quietly. I never admitted that to him. Perhaps I should have. With that cryptic acknowledgement, he left, the sound of his walker scraping against the hardwood floors echoing through the house that was now half mine by right. I remained in Thomas's office long after Earl had gone, surrounded by the artifacts of my husband's life and the sudden, weighty responsibility of protecting what he'd loved. Outside the window, I could see the fields stretching toward the horizon, golden in the late afternoon sunlight, the same fields my grandmother had walked as a young woman, forming the friendship with Evelyn Blackwood that would eventually change the course of our family histories. I thought of Theo finding the deed, as if guided by some unseen hand to uncover a truth that had been waiting patiently for decades to emerge. Perhaps there was meaning in the timing, painful though it was. Perhaps this was exactly when the truth needed to come to light, when I was finally ready to stand firm without Thomas beside me. The weeks that followed Earl's visit were a strange mixture of grief and purpose. I moved through the necessary rituals of widowhood, thank you notes for funeral flowers, decisions about Thomas's clothing and personal effects, adjusting to sleeping alone in our bed after nearly half a century of his steady breathing beside me. But alongside these private navigations of loss, a parallel process unfolded. The formal assertion of my rights to half of Blackwood Heritage Farm. Catherine Miles, Rebecca's friend and now my attorney, guided me through the complexities of officially recording the long-hidden deed, filing the necessary paperwork to establish my ownership, and preparing for the resistance we knew would come from the Blackwood side of the family. True to my expectations, Richard launched the first salvo exactly 17 days after Thomas's funeral. A formal letter from the prestigious law firm, where he was a senior partner, challenging the validity of Evelyn's deed on multiple grounds and demanding that I cease all attempts to claim ownership of any portion of Blackwood Heritage Farm pending resolution of these substantive legal questions. Catherine read the letter calmly in my kitchen, then set it aside with a small smile that reminded me of a cat spotting an unwary mouse. "Predictable," she remarked, sipping the coffee I'd made, "and not particularly creative. They're hoping to intimidate you with legal jargon and the firm's reputation. Standard opening move. Will it work?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Catherine's smile widened slightly. "Not a chance. I've already filed the deed with the county recorder's office. It's officially part of the public record now, with a notation regarding the date of original execution. We've also submitted affidavits from 2 individuals who were present when your grandmother and Evelyn Blackwood signed the document: Meredith Johnson, who was Evelyn's nurse, and Pastor David Wilson, who served as a witness. Both are still alive. Both have clear memories of the event, and both have signed statements confirming that Evelyn was of sound mind and acting of her own free will. I stared at her in astonishment. How did you find them? After all these years? Catherine looked pleased with herself, and rightfully so. Pastor Wilson was easy. He's retired but still lives in the next county. Mrs. Johnson required more digging. She moved to Arizona in the 1980s, but she remembers the day clearly. She said Evelyn was determined that your grandmother received recognition for her friendship and support during Evelyn's illness. According to Mrs. Johnson, Evelyn knew her son might try to intervene, which is why she asked your grandmother to keep the deed secret until she felt the timing was right. This new information sent a wave of emotion through my sadness that my grandmother had carried this secret to her grave. Gratitude for Evelyn Blackwood's foresight and determination, and a renewed sense of purpose in honoring both women's intentions. What happens next? I asked, mentally preparing myself for the battle ahead. Catherine gathered her papers into a neat stack, her efficiency reassuring. Next, we request a meeting with the Blackwood family representatives and their attorneys. We present our evidence, which is substantial, and outline our proposed terms for moving forward cooperatively. Then we see if they're willing to be reasonable, or if they prefer a public legal fight that they're likely to lose. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the offices of Harrington, Beck and Associates in downtown Cedar Grove Neutral Territory, neither Blackwood property nor my home. Catherine advised me to dress conservatively but confidently, no funeral black, but nothing too bold either, and to let her do most of the talking. Your presence is crucial, she explained. This is ultimately about your right to what's legally yours, but legal negotiations can get technical and adversarial quickly. Let me handle the parrying and thrusting. I nodded, grateful for her expertise and for the strength she seemed to radiate, a quality I was working to cultivate in myself during these challenging days. When Tuesday arrived, I chose a navy blue dress with a simple pearl necklace that Thomas had given me for our 30th anniversary. As I fastened the clasp, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror, woman in her late 60s with silver-streaked dark hair, lines of grief still fresh around her eyes, but a steadiness in her posture that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. I wish you were here, I whispered to Thomas's absent presence, but I think you'd be proud of what I'm doing. I could almost hear his gentle laugh, feel his hands on my shoulders as he so often stood behind me while I prepared for social functions. Almost, but not quite. The phantom touch faded, leaving only my own reflection and the task ahead. The conference room at Harrington, Beck and Associates was designed to impress wood-paneled walls, leather chairs, and a long table polished to a mirror shine. Catherine and I arrived exactly 5 minutes early, as she had advised. We were shown in by a receptionist who offered water or coffee, which we both declined. Better to avoid bathroom breaks during crucial negotiations, Catherine murmured with a wink as we took our seats. I arranged my copy of the deed, the affidavits, and my grandmother's note on the table before me, taking comfort in the tangible evidence of my claim. The Blackwood contingent arrived precisely on time. Earl, in a wheelchair pushed by James, Eleanor walking stiffly with a cane, her recent fall having apparently done more damage than initially assessed, Richard in an expensive suit that screamed corporate attorney, and 2 other lawyers I didn't recognize. Notably absent were my children, who had unanimously supported my decision to assert my ownership rights, but had agreed that their presence might complicate an already tense situation. Theo had wanted to come. It's my discovery, Grandma. But even he had been persuaded that this initial meeting should involve only the direct stakeholders and their legal representatives. Introductions were made with frigid politeness. The 2 unfamiliar attorneys were Martin Delaney, the Blackwoods' longtime family lawyer, and Sophia Reeves, a specialist in property law whom Richard had brought in from his firm's Boston office. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as we all took our seats. Adversaries across a gleaming battlefield of mahogany. Martin Delaney spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of decades in boardrooms and courthouses. We're here to discuss a matter that, in our view, should never have escalated to this point. A misunderstanding about a document of questionable provenance and validity that has created unnecessary tension during what should be a time of mourning for both the Blackwood and Collins families. Catherine didn't bother to hide her skeptical expression. If we're being honest, Mr. Delaney, there's no misunderstanding here. There's a legally executed deed transferring ownership of half of Blackwood Heritage Farm from Evelyn Blackwood to Martha Collins, dated October 14, 1979. There are 2 living witnesses who have provided sworn affidavits confirming the legitimacy of that transaction. The deed has now been properly recorded with the county. My client, Mrs. Martha Blackwood, is the rightful heir to her grandmother's property interest. Those are the facts. The only misunderstanding was the deliberate concealment of these facts from my client for over 40 years. Richard leaned forward, his expression hard. Let's not be disingenuous, Catherine. You know as well as I do that there are serious questions about the validity of this supposed transfer. The statute of limitations for recording a deed. The lack of consideration $1 is hardly adequate for property of this value. Potential undue influence, given Evelyn Blackwood's medical condition at the time. He ticked off points on his fingers like a professor listing exam topics. Not to mention the suspicious timing of this document's sudden appearance, conveniently after my uncle's death when he can no longer offer his perspective. I felt a flash of anger at the insinuation, but kept my expression neutral, as Catherine had advised. She smiled thinly at Richard. I'm prepared to address each of those concerns in detail, Counselor. The statute of limitations applies to challenges to a deed, not to the recording of one. The $1 consideration is symbolic but legally sufficient, as I'm sure Ms. Reeves will confirm if asked directly. She nodded toward the property specialist, whose slight grimace suggested Catherine was correct. As for undue influence, our affidavits specifically address Evelyn Blackwood's mental clarity and determination regarding this gift. And the timing was not convenient, but tragic. The deed was discovered by Martha's grandson days before Thomas Blackwood's death, not after it. The legal parrying continued for nearly an hour, with Catherine dismantling each objection raised by the Blackwood attorneys. I watched Earl during this exchange, noting how he remained largely silent, his gaze often fixed on the table rather than meeting my eyes. Eleanor, by contrast, radiated barely contained fury, her knuckles white around the handle of her cane. Finally, during a brief pause while Richard conferred quietly with Sophia Reeves, Earl raised a hand to silence them. Enough, he said, his voice carrying surprising authority despite its age-weakened tone. We're wasting time and money on arguments that won't resolve this situation. All eyes turned to him, including Eleanor's, which widened in surprise or alarm. I couldn't tell which. Earl looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. Martha, I've had time to reflect since our conversation in Thomas's office. I've discussed this situation with my remaining son, my grandsons, and my attorneys. I've reviewed the evidence you've presented. He paused, drawing a breath that seemed to require significant effort, and I've come to a decision. I am prepared to acknowledge your ownership of half of Blackwood Heritage Farm, as conveyed by my mother to your grandmother in 1979. Eleanor gasped. Earl, you can't possibly. He silenced her with a raised hand, never breaking eye contact with me. I am 89 years old. Eleanor, I have buried my son, our son. I have no desire to spend my remaining days in courtrooms, fighting a battle that evidence suggests we would ultimately lose, and damaging the Blackwood name in the process. He shifted his gaze to Richard, who looked like he'd bitten into something sour. Sometimes, even in law, there comes a point where the wisest course is to acknowledge reality and find the best path forward from there. A heavy silence filled the room. Catherine glanced at me, eyebrows raised slightly in a question. I gave an almost imperceptible nod. My client appreciates your willingness to acknowledge her rightful claim, Mr. Blackwood, she said formally. However, there are practical matters of co-ownership that need to be addressed. The management of the property, decision-making authority, profit distribution, and future planning, particularly in light of the trust you announced at the anniversary party. She opened a folder and extracted a document. We've prepared a proposal for a co-ownership agreement that we believe is fair to all parties and honors both the Blackwood and Collins interests in the property. Earl nodded to Martin Delaney, who accepted the document and began to review it. "We'll need time to consider the specific terms," Earl said. "But I want to be clear about my intentions. I am willing to acknowledge Martha's ownership. I am not, however, prepared to cede management control of Blackwood Heritage Farm to someone with no experience running an agricultural business of this scale, regardless of their legal ownership stake." His gaze remained steady on mine. "The farm must continue to operate. Jobs depend on it. Contracts must be fulfilled. The Blackwood management team has the expertise and connections to ensure that happens." I had anticipated this position, the acknowledgement of my ownership, coupled with an attempt to limit my actual authority. Catherine had prepared me for it. "I understand your concern for the farm's continued operation," I replied, speaking directly for the first time since the meeting began. "I have no intention of disrupting the agricultural business that Thomas helped build, but I will have a voice in decisions that affect the property. I will have access to financial records, and I will have the right to pass my ownership interest to my children, just as you have the right to determine the future of your half." Eleanor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Earl's announcement, suddenly slammed her cane against the floor. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, color high in her cheeks. "Martha knows nothing about running a farm, nothing about agricultural markets or equipment investments or crop rotation. She was a high school English teacher who married into our family. She ran the business into the ground with her interference." The outburst hung in the air, raw and revealing. In Eleanor's view, I would always be an outsider, regardless of my 45-year marriage to her son or my legal rights to the property. "Actually, Eleanor," I said quietly, "I know quite a lot about Blackwood Heritage Farm. I've lived there for 45 years. I've kept the books when Thomas needed help. I've managed the household that feeds the workers during harvest. I've attended agricultural conferences with Thomas, spoken with equipment dealers, reviewed contracts." I held her gaze steadily. "And more importantly, I have 3 children who grew up on that land, who understand its value and potential. Rebecca may be a surgeon, but she studied agricultural science before medical school. Michael writes about sustainable farming practices for national publications, and Lily has photographed agricultural communities across 6 continents. The Collins Blackwood generation has expertise you've never bothered to recognize." Martin Delaney cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the need to diffuse the tension. "Perhaps we can agree to a transitional arrangement," he suggested. "Mr. Blackwood acknowledges Mrs. Blackwood's ownership interest. The current management team continues day-to-day operations for a specified period, say 6 months, while Mrs. Blackwood and her advisors review the business thoroughly. During that time, major decisions require joint approval. After the transition period, we revisit the management structure based on a clearer understanding of all parties' capabilities and intentions." Catherine looked at me questioningly. The proposal wasn't perfect, but it was reasonably starting point for negotiation rather than a protracted legal battle. I could accept a transitional arrangement, I agreed, with some modifications. 3 months rather than 6. Full access to all financial and operational records from day one. And an independent audit of the farm's finances for the past 5 years, to establish a clear baseline. I glanced at Earl, whose expression had grown increasingly weary. "I have no desire to dismantle what the Blackwoods have built, but I need to understand exactly what my grandmother's half-ownership entails in practical terms." The negotiation continued for another 2 hours, moving from broad principles to specific details: access rights, decision-making protocols, profit distribution, communication requirements. Throughout it all, I felt Thomas's absence acutely. He should have been there, helping to bridge the divide between the family he was born into and the family we had created together. But perhaps, I reflected as we finally reached a tentative agreement, his absence was what made this resolution possible. Without Thomas as a buffer between me and his parents, we were forced to deal directly with each other, to finally confront the reality that had been hidden for so many years. As the meeting concluded and documents were gathered for formal drafting, Earl gestured for me to join him by the window, away from the others, his wheelchair positioned to face the tree-lined street below. He spoke softly so that only I could hear. "I want you to know something, Martha. Thomas suspected the truth about the farm's ownership." I stared at him, stunned by this revelation. He found some of Mother's papers in the attic, about 15 years ago, not the deed itself, but letters that hinted at her intentions. He confronted me privately. "And you lied to him," I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of what must have happened. Earl nodded, regret evident in the deep lines of his face. "I did. I told him it was just Mother's sentimental ramblings, that no formal transfer had ever occurred, and he chose to believe me, or at least, to act as if he did." Earl's gaze remained fixed on the street below. "Do you know why?" I shook my head, trying to process this new information. "Because he told me that if it were true, if your grandmother really did own half the farm, he would have to choose between his father's dishonesty and his wife's rightful inheritance, and he wasn't ready to make that choice." The revelation left me breathless. Thomas had suspected, had perhaps even known, and had chosen to maintain the fragile peace rather than confront the truth that might have torn his family apart. I wasn't sure whether to feel betrayed by his silence or touched by his desire to protect both me and his father from a painful reckoning. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked finally. Earl turned his wheelchair to face me directly, his eyes so like Thomas's, meeting mine with unexpected directness. "Because you deserve to know that he wasn't completely in the dark. And because I want you to understand that my decision today isn't just about legal evidence or public embarrassment. It's about honoring what Thomas ultimately wanted for his family, all of his family, to find a way forward together." I nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in my throat. Earl reached out a weathered hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. His grip was fragile but determined. "We'll never be friends, Martha," he said with blunt honesty. "Too much has happened. Too many years of what we've been, what we can be partners in preserving what Thomas loved, for his sake, and for the next generation. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, those might never be possible between us, but it was acknowledgement. And after 45 years as a Blackwood by marriage, but never by acceptance, acknowledgement was no small thing." The formal announcement of our agreement came 2 weeks later, at a gathering of family members and key farm employees in the main barn that had been converted for the occasion into an impromptu meeting space. Hay bales covered with quilts served as seating. Strings of lights hung from the rafters cast a warm glow over the weathered wood, and a podium had been set up at the front, a blend of rustic tradition and official ceremony that seemed fitting for the occasion. Earl insisted on standing for the announcement, leaning heavily on his walker but refusing the wheelchair. Eleanor sat rigid beside him, her public face firmly in place despite her private objections to the settlement we'd reached. For over a century, Blackwood Heritage Farm has represented our family's connection to this land, Earl began, his voice stronger than I'd heard it since Thomas's death. "Today, we acknowledge a truth that should have been recognized long ago. This farm is not solely Blackwood land. It is Blackwood Collins land, and has been since 1979, when my mother, Evelyn Blackwood, transferred half ownership to Martha Collins, grandmother of Martha Blackwood, in recognition of their friendship and Martha Collins's contribution to this community." A murmur ran through the gathering. Some already knew, others were hearing the news for the first time. Earl continued, outlining the co-ownership agreement we had reached, the transition period, the joint management structure that would follow, the commitment to preserving the farm's operations while acknowledging both families' interests. Throughout his speech, I watched the faces of those gathered. My children, proudly supportive, the farm managers, concerned but professional, the extended Blackwood relatives, ranging from shocked to calculating as they assessed how this change might affect their connections to the family wealth. And through it all, I felt a growing sense of rightness, of a long-delayed justice finally being served. When Earl finished speaking, he gestured for me to join him at the podium. I moved forward, conscious of all eyes following my progress. For a moment, I was reminded of my first Blackwood family gathering after marrying Thomas. The scrutiny, the whispered assessments, the sense of being measured against some unspoken standard and found wanting. But this time was different. This time I moved not as an outsider seeking acceptance, but as a rightful co-owner, acknowledging my place. I took my position beside Earl, accepting the microphone he offered with a nod of thanks. "Thank you, Earl," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. "I stand before you today with mixed feelings. grief for Thomas, who should be here with us, gratitude to my grandmother and to Evelyn Blackwood for their friendship that transcended social boundaries, and hope for the future of this land that has been my home for 45 years. I scanned the faces before me, finding my children's encouraging smiles, Theo's proud grin. I want to be clear about my intentions. I don't seek to disrupt what generations of Blackwoods have built. I seek to honor it, to preserve it, and yes, to ensure that the Collins contribution to its success is finally acknowledged. I spoke for only a few minutes, emphasizing continuity alongside necessary change, respect for tradition alongside openness to new ideas. As I concluded, I found myself looking directly at Eleanor, whose expression remained impassive, but whose eyes betrayed a complex mixture of resentment and resignation. This farm has been the site of both conflict and celebration, of hard work and precious memories, I said. It has witnessed marriages and births, disputes and reconciliations, successes and failures. Today, it witnesses acknowledgement of a truth long hidden, and the beginning of a new chapter for the Blackwood and Collins families together. I returned the microphone to Earl, who accepted it with a nod that contained more respect than he had shown me in 4 decades. The gathering transitioned to a more informal reception, with food and drinks served as family members and employees approached me with questions, congratulations, or barely disguised curiosity. Rebecca, Michael, and Lily stationed themselves protectively around me, fielding inquiries and deflecting the occasionally hostile comment from a Blackwood relative who hadn't fully accepted the new reality. Theo slipped his hand into mine as the evening progressed, looking up with those perceptive eyes that had seen what generations of adults had overlooked. "Are you the boss of the farm now, Grandma?" he asked, his question cutting through the adult complexities to the heart of the matter. I smiled, squeezing his small hand. "Not the boss, sweetheart. A guardian, maybe. Like your great-great-grandma Martha was, though she never got to claim the title." He considered this seriously. "Will people be mad at me for finding the paper?" The question revealed the burden he'd been carrying, responsibility for a discovery that had changed so many lives. I knelt to meet his eyes directly, ignoring the protest from my aging knees. "Some people might be, for a while," I answered honestly. "But you did exactly the right thing. You found a truth that needed to be found. That's never wrong, even when it's difficult." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "Grandpa would think so too," he said with the certainty of childhood. "He always told me that truth matters more than being comfortable." The simple wisdom brought tears to my eyes. Thomas had indeed believed that, had lived by it in most things except, perhaps, in the matter of the farm's ownership, where comfort and family peace had won out over a confrontation with painful truth. But even there, he had passed his values to the next generation, values that had ultimately led to this moment of recognition and justice. In the months that followed the announcement, a new routine emerged at Blackwood Collins Heritage Farm, the official name change registered with appropriate authorities. True to our agreement, I immersed myself in learning the business side of the operation, reviewing financial statements with Rebecca's help, attending meetings with distributors and equipment suppliers, consulting with agricultural experts about sustainable practices that might enhance both profitability and environmental stewardship. Michael drafted a history of the farm that acknowledged both families' contributions, to be featured on our newly designed website. Lily's photographs of the land through the seasons became part of our marketing materials, putting a fresh face on a century-old enterprise. Eleanor maintained her distance, retreating to the smaller Blackwood property in town where she'd lived before marrying Earl. She appeared at obligatory family functions, but avoided direct interaction with me when possible. I understood her withdrawal as the mourning of multiple losses: her son, her status as unchallenged Blackwood matriarch, her conception of family legacy. Perhaps in time, especially as she developed relationships with her great-grandchildren, the wounds might begin to heal. But I had stopped expecting or requiring her acceptance. The deed had given me legal recognition. I no longer needed Eleanor's emotional validation to secure my place. Earl, surprisingly, became something of an ally in navigating the transition. His health declined gradually, but his mind remained sharp, and he seemed genuinely interested in sharing his knowledge of the business he'd built. We established a weekly meeting in Thomas's office, now mine, where He would explain market trends, recall negotiations with particular buyers, or outline the reasoning behind past expansion decisions. There was a freedom in these conversations, a directness that had never been possible while Thomas was alive, and Earl was torn between his son and his conception of the Blackwood legacy. We would never recover the decades lost to secrecy and prejudice, but we found a measure of respect in these final chapters. 1 year after Thomas's death, on a perfect spring day when the orchards were in full bloom and the air was sweet with promise, I stood alone beneath the old sycamore tree where Thomas and I had first fallen in love. I carried a small cedar box, my grandmother's box now, containing both Evelyn's deed and letter, and my grandmother's note to me. The safety deposit box key had indeed opened a small lockbox at First National Bank in Cedar Grove, containing additional documentation of the land transfer, and a more detailed letter from my grandmother explaining her decision to honor Evelyn's request for secrecy. Some truths must wait for the right moment, she had written. Trust that you will know when that moment comes. I placed my hand against the rough bark of the sycamore, feeling the solid reality of its trunk, the living continuity it represented. This tree had witnessed the beginning of Thomas's and my story, had stood silent sentinel through decades of hidden truths and unspoken tensions, and now bore witness to the resolution that had come too late for Thomas to see, but perhaps exactly when it needed to for the next generation. We did it, I whispered, to Thomas, to my grandmother, to Evelyn Blackwood, to all those who had played their parts in this long, complicated story of land and legacy, love and justice. The breeze stirred the new leaves overhead, sending dappled sunlight dancing across the ground at my feet. I inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of earth and growth and possibility. In the distance, I could see Theo walking with his father across the eastern field, their figures silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Richard had been the last to accept the new reality of the farm's ownership, his attorney's mind still searching for loopholes long after Earl had acknowledged the truth. But even he had gradually come to terms with the situation, perhaps influenced by his son's unwavering conviction that justice had finally been served. As I watched them, Theo pointed to something in the field, and Richard knelt to examine it more closely. A teaching moment, father to son, on land that would one day be part of Theo's inheritance, not just as a Blackwood, but as a Collins Blackwood, with all the complexity and richness that dual heritage entailed. I smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had eluded me for so long. The farm would continue, evolving with each generation, bearing the imprints of all who had worked its soil and breathed its air, including me, especially me, the housekeeper's daughter who had loved a Blackwood son, raised 3 children on contested land, and finally claimed her rightful place in a story much older and larger than any one person's life. I turned back toward the farmhouse, my farmhouse now, indeed as well as in daily life, and began the walk home. The path was familiar, worn smooth by countless journeys back and forth over 45 years of marriage. But now I walked it differently, with the certainty of belonging that comes not from permission granted but from truth acknowledged. My footsteps were firm, my posture straight despite the weight of recent grief and decades of unspoken resentment. I was Martha Collins Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Collins Heritage Farm, widow of Thomas, mother of Rebecca, Michael, and Lily, grandmother of Theo, and 4 others. I was exactly where I was meant to be, at exactly the right time. And so, my friends, that's how I found myself witnessing my mother-in-law face first in anniversary cake, while my grandson revealed the truth that changed everything. If someone you know is being made to feel less than, on their own rightful ground, share my story with them. If you're holding on to a truth that waits for the right moment, trust your instincts about when that moment comes. And if you're wondering what I'd do differently, looking back on it, I'd say this: I wouldn't wait for someone else to discover what should have been mine all along. The deed was always there, waiting to be found. The truth doesn't expire, even when hidden for decades. Remember that, and while you're here, subscribe to hear more stories from those of us who've learned life's hardest lessons. I'm Martha Collins Blackwood, recording from the study of Blackwood Collins Heritage Farm, where the view out my window is finally, legally, half mine.